Welcome to Conversations the World Over. I'm Raymond Arroyo. This week marks the 25th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall, marking the end of Soviet communism. My guest tonight is an editor-at-large at National Review, and he joined me to talk about a book he had written dealing with the leadership of three historic figures who all contributed to the end of one of the most destructive ideologies the world has ever known. The book, The President, the Pope, and the Prime Minister, told the story of President Ronald Reagan, Pope John Paul II, and Margaret Thatcher, and how they joined forces to meet the challenge of communism, and what we can learn from them today. Here's my conversation with John O'Sullivan. It's rather amazing that you had these three giants, really, both in political and in some cases spiritual terms, arrive on the scene at the same time. Where are their counterparts today, John?
Well, first of all, great leaders like that don't come along by every bus. Mm-hmm. There was a 40-year gap between Churchill and Roosevelt and the arrival of Reagan and Thatcher. And there was a gap of almost as long between the death of Pius XII and the arrival of John Paul II. What causes them to emerge? Well, I think the gravity of the crisis is one of the main things. Great leaders tend not to emerge, particularly in democracies, during easy times. But when you have grave crises, then somehow we summon them forth, or God does, and that's what happened on this occasion. The crises were grave, the leaders emerged.
Yeah, amazing. You identify faith, self-reliance, and patriotism as the common attributes that these men and one woman shared. Is that what linked them, that common love of those ideals?
Well, I think that I would say that the answer is yes, but I would identify self-reliance with Mrs. Thatcher, I would identify patriotism with Ronald Reagan, and I would identify faith with John Paul II. Now, I also think they each possessed the other qualities, you understand, but they're the three qualities which it seems to me each of them individually embody.
What made you want to write this sort of flyover, if you will, of these three great leaders and link them together?
Well, I agree with you that what happened in the 70s and 80s was an astonishing series of events. I mean, everybody had assumed, including, by the way, the Vatican diplomats, that communism was a permanent feature of our lives, that Eastern Europe was going to be ruled by the Soviet Union, more or less, not forever, but for the historically foreseeable period. Why did it collapse? Well, partly because it had internal problems, but it had had internal problems since 1917. So the next question was, well, who brought this about? Other statesmen in the West, other popes, had blocked the advance, but they hadn't brought it down. And when I looked at the people, I thought these were the three people who did it. And by the way, I have to say that my publishers encouraged me to think in these terms. So when I looked at they were the three main ones, although, as I think you would agree, people like Lech Wałęsa in Poland, people like Václav Havel in the Czech Republic, they too played an important part, and the ordinary people behind the Iron Curtain.
I want to isolate each of these leaders for a moment. John Paul II, you say in the book, he had this quality of being at once personal and traditional. Was that the thing that made him so appealing, and why did the times cry out for someone who embodied both of those attributes?
I think the Church was in crisis in the 1960s and 70s. It was in crisis because it had tried to reform itself in relation with the Second Vatican Council. And that had created tensions within the Church in various ways, which the Church then had to cope with. Now, obviously, the radicals didn't want completely orthodox figures, and the orthodox did not want completely radical figures. What they were looking for was someone who could unite the Church on the basis of what I would call a tolerant traditionalism, and that's what he embodied.
Let's talk about this similarity between Reagan and John Paul II in that they both came from an acting background, John. How did this make them aware of an audience? And really, they were really embodying their own message. So it wasn't just an act, but the awareness of an audience. How important was that in conveying this message to the American people and to the Polish people?
They were both actors, as you said. They were also, by the way, both writers. It's something which is often forgotten, but we now know that Reagan wrote a great deal as a student. And we know, of course, the Pope wrote plays, and as well as his more important theological works. Reagan himself said at one point, people have asked, how can an actor be a president? I would rather ask, how can anyone who's not an actor be a president? Because an actor is someone who, when he goes out onto the stage, thinks himself into the role and is able to impress the audience with what he stands for. There was a very dramatic example of this in Reagan's presidency, and that was when he met Gorbachev for the first time at the Geneva summit meeting. And he went down not wearing a top coat, hatless, vigorous, somehow younger than his younger counterpart, and more or less by that action of showing his dynamism, his essential strength, he took control of the entire occasion, took control in the eyes of the world, took control, I think, by the way, in the eyes of Gorbachev, who more or less acknowledges that. The Pope himself, immediately he became Pope, everybody, and I'm not just talking about Catholics here, I'm talking about people who were, if any, some of them agnostic, some quite anti-Catholic. They were all impressed by the astonishing way he simply presented the papacy as something dramatic, new, appealing, attractive. I remember many conversations at the time about the Pope's theatrical ability, but I think that, as you said, the theatrical ability only works because what they are presenting is what is real. I mean, you can carry off a false performance once or twice, yeah, but you can't make a lifetime of it.
No, there was an authenticity that both of them had.
That's
right. And a real power, a simplicity too, which you mention in the book. Both Reagan and John Paul had this ability. I think John Paul more by his example than his words, because the words got a little convoluted at times. But Reagan, in the simplicity of his words, could convey these enormous and rather difficult concepts at the time to hear. How important was the way he communicated this message, particularly in regards to communism and the threat there?
Oh, very important. I'll give you a story. George Shultz brought in a speech once to him and said, I'd like you to see this, Mr. President. And Reagan said, well, you know, George, I trust you. I'm sure it's a good speech. And he said, well, no, I would really like you to see it. And Reagan read it and gave it back to him and said, that's fine. Schultz sensed that Reagan wasn't entirely happy. And he said, look, tell me what's wrong. And he said, well, George, I'd do it this way. And he went through the first page and he made about 3 corrections. And when Schultz saw them, he said, they made the speech live when before it had been a bureaucratic document dead on the page. Now, that's what he did across the board. But in relation to communism, he did something else. He told the truth. He said that this is a doctrine which is hostile to humanity and which humanity is rejecting and will shortly reject entirely. And no one had had the courage and the honesty to do that before, and it had a huge impact. At first, unfavorable in the American and European establishments, but immediately favorable in the most important place of all, in the Gulag. The word passed from mouth to mouth of what Reagan had done when he made the speech about the evil empire. It gave them heart, it gave them hope.
And that resistance rose, and that was all part of John Paul's approach too. That cultural resistance, inflaming the dissidents in the underground, and it worked.
It worked tremendously. Obviously, the beginning of the end of communism, it seems to me, is John Paul's visit to Poland in June 1979, because everybody who attended his meetings and his open-air masses, and remember, about 1/3 of all Poles did so, and practically every other Pole saw it on television. Everyone who attended them was making a public act of defiance of the regime. And when he turned to the guy next to him, he realized, well, he's doing the same thing, and so is he. So all of a sudden, these people can trust each other. They know that they're united for God and for liberty against the facade of communist oppression.
Amazing. Let's talk for a moment about the way these 3 people, President Reagan, Pope John Paul, and Lady Thatcher, all at once rise up really within a 26-month span, as you point out in the book, which is something that I had totally forgotten. Do you see the hand of Providence in all of that, John?
Well, let's take your question a little further. Let's point out also that within a month of 2 months of becoming president, Reagan, somebody tries to kill Reagan. Right. Somebody tries a month later to kill the Pope. In each case, the bullet passes within an inch of their hearts and goes through their body without doing absolutely serious damage, although they are close to death, as a matter of fact. Lady Thatcher suffers a similar assault on her life 2 years later. All of these people survive by inches in the case of the Pope and Reagan, by a room in the case of Lady Thatcher. Well, I don't think you can list that series of events and consider what they did afterwards without feeling a chill going up and down your spine, a feeling that this is more than a series of accidents. And that, of course, is what Reagan and the Pope both thought.
Mm-hmm. And following that, they all come to these epiphanies, if you will, which your book is really a revelation on, the personal prayers they have following that. John Paul saying there's no coincidence in Providence, of course, later in the hospital. Reagan's prayer for the soul of Hinckley. Tell us about that. I don't know how that episode eluded me. I've read Dutch and everything, and I didn't see that before.
Well, you know, everybody knows, of course, that the Pope went out of his way to forgive his attempted assassin. And by the way, he befriended the man's family, who expressed great sorrow at the time of his death. Ronald Reagan, very few people knew about this, but Ronald Reagan approached the doctor who was caring for Mr. Hinckley in the Virginia hospital and said he would like to see Mr. Hinckley and forgive him as well. But the doctor felt that this was not something which was conducive to Hinckley's health, and so that didn't happen. But, you know, even more remarkable than Reagan's behavior on that occasion is his behavior actually on the operating table, because he hears a nurse say, "My goodness, he's been shot." And as he hears those words, the president remembers a figure crouching and firing a gun. And of course, a perfectly natural anger wells up inside him at the memory of this. He immediately crushes that anger, and he says, if I'm to ask God for forgiveness, I too have got to forgive this young man. He assumed it was a young man. And I think that's one of the most remarkable things in the book, actually, and one of the most remarkable things about President Reagan, and fully justifies what John Paul II said in his letter of condolence to Nancy Reagan, which is he commended his noble soul to God, and I think noble soul is absolutely right.
And they all feel, following these episodes, let's talk about Lady Thatcher now. A blast goes off in Brighton, correct?
Brighton Hotel.
And a blast goes off. She is spared, though many people in the government are killed, friends. It was a ball,
5 people
correct?
are killed, yes, that's right. Five friends of hers, by the way, are killed. She has just left the bathroom, and had she remained in the bathroom, she would have been, at the very least, very severely injured and probably killed. Now, I have to tell you, when I saw Lady Thatcher, and I said to her, both Reagan and the Pope felt that God had spared them on this occasion for some great purpose. Do you feel that God had intervened to spare your life for some great purpose? And she said, no. Now, I was very struck by this, but I thought I knew the reason, so I chased her, so to speak, down the argument. She's a Methodist. She's a very practical-minded Christian. Immediately the following day after the assassination attempt, she goes to the hospital, she tries to get a doctor who will look after this man who's suffering and so on. So she's very active in thinking about others. But she felt it would be vainglorious to think that God had intervened to save her when another 5 people had died, and she didn't like to think of it in those terms.
Catholics have no such humility.
No,
but,
it is a very different outlook, as a matter of fact.
Well, because both Reagan, and who was not Catholic, but as you pointed out, certainly culturally Catholic, and many of his advisors and those in the cabinet were Catholics, they both have this sense that God has saved them. And Reagan, I think, says, whatever time I've left, I have to give to God, and I'll use to his end. I have to tell you, when I read the book, I was, though Lady Thatcher comes across as certainly present, a cheerleader, and in Europe, the sole voice of sanity on many issues, I almost felt she was a spectator to the fall of communism per se. How does she figure, and why did you decide to include her as one of these figures who really toppled the evil empire?
I think she's crucial. I think she's crucial for 3 reasons. By the way, I think that if you take the 3 figures, I think Reagan is the pivotal one, because he has the close relationship with the Pope, he has the close relationship with Mrs. Thatcher. Lady Thatcher and the Pope have a relationship, but it's not of the same depth and importance. But she was crucial for these reasons. First of all, she was extremely important in giving assistance and aid to Ronald Reagan, domestically and internationally. She can't if you go back to the 1980s, you must remember that Reagan had a difficult battle in this country to get his way, and her support was important. Secondly, without her, I don't believe the missiles, US missiles, would have been installed in Western Europe, and that was the defeat of the Soviet Union militarily in the Cold War. And thirdly, remember Gorbachev is economics. Gorbachev told the Politburo, we have to change because Singapore is exporting more in value than we are every year. What Mrs. Thatcher did was she was even more important than Reagan in bringing about the worldwide transformation of capitalism to a new modern information economy that was leaving the Soviets behind. Her revolution of privatization, which was worldwide, and she began it, and there was not something which happened here, that was a very, very important element in changing the 1980s.
Describe the interaction between John Paul II and Reagan's inner circle, particularly Vernon Walters and the CIA director, Bill Casey. What was that relationship really like, and do you buy the Bernstein-Politi version of this?
The answer is that it was an extremely important relationship. As you mentioned before, several of those advisors, including Richard Allen and including Alexander Haig, were Catholics. They established a relationship of trust with the Vatican very early on, and as you know, they made available to the Pope intelligence, US intelligence about what was happening in Eastern Europe and elsewhere. Now, the way I read it is that there was a coincidence of interests between the Vatican on the one hand and the American government on the other. That coincidence of interests was particularly important in relation to winning the Cold War and in relation to Poland. There wasn't a plot in the sense that the Reagan exchanged a deal with the Pope, which I think is what Bernstein and Politi
were hinting at.
Tremble on the verge of saying. At the same time, I don't regard their book. I regard their book as a very, very interesting, well-researched, and full of fascinating material. And I think it's pardonable for journalists to try to stretch things in this way. But as I say, I don't actually agree with the deal argument. What I will say finally is this: the meeting between the Pope and Reagan in June 1982, at which the Pope emerged saying to the Cardinals Casaroli and Silverini, Reagan is a good man. He's a disarmer. He wants to get rid of nuclear missiles. I think that was of crucial importance in the relationship because it meant that thereafter the Pope knew that Reagan could be trusted to make the decisions because he was to make these kind of decisions because he had the correct moral principles at the back of his mind.
And it was at a time, we should say, as you point out in the book, the USCCB, the Bishops' Conference in the United States and in other parts of the world, were railing against Reagan's policy, saying he was a hawk, he was trying to destroy the world and arming everybody. So a crucial endorsement, yes?
A crucial endorsement because, as you well know, not only did the Pope not agree to campaign against the Strategic Defense Initiative, he actually also got the US Catholic bishops to tone down their criticism of American policy in the famous nuclear pastoral.
Tell me materially, what was that interaction between the Vatican and the Reagan administration? How did they help each other? How deep a collaboration was that to bring down communism?
I would single out two things. First of all, of course, as you know, Vernon Walters made several visits and a whole series of visits to the Vatican in which he presented the Pope with information about what was going on in Eastern Europe, what Soviet policy was doing. The second was, of course, that both the Vatican and the American government assisted Solidarity, the underground trade union, which by this time, after the imposition of martial law, was operating underground, but had also become more than a union. It was now fundamentally a Polish national revival, nationalist movement. And the CIA sent assistance through the US labor movement to them. The Vatican used its own channels, and I think that there was a great deal of collaboration in that way. But it was collaboration in which each side was acting entirely on its own terms. In other words, the Pope was acting in order to protect religious liberty in his homeland. The American government was acting in order actually to advance regular political liberty and to create difficulties for its principal rival in world affairs, which it did very effectively, because I think that it was the survival of Solidarity and its example in Eastern Europe that was one of the major factors that brought communism crashing down.
Amazing. You had access, as you say in the book, to Gorbachev Foundation documents, now classified documents, reclassified documents, which detail the President Gorbachev's interaction with heads of state around the world. How crucial were those documents in writing the book, and what did you discover there that's new?
I think that they were extremely useful. I wouldn't use the word crucial in the book, but I would say they were extremely useful because they illuminated the policy of the Soviet Union, and particularly the recognition of its own difficulties. As early, for example, as 1982, you have a senior Politburo official write in his diary, the way things are going, we're going to have a Russian Poland here in 10 years' time, by which he meant, of course, that Soviet communism would face the same crises and terminal crises almost that Polish communism was then undergoing. And he was out by 1 year. 9 years later, not 10, the system crashed. But as early as that, you could see that really far-sighted, well-informed officials knew that they were facing great difficulties. By the way, they knew that partly because, as the official wrote, we're going to face an ideological offensive from Reagan. Not a shooting war, he specifically says this, not a shooting war, but a war of ideas and an ideological offensive. Now that was something which, of course, the following year Reagan did launch to great effect, and something which all of the bien-pensants and the wise old men of the West all deprecated and said was disgraceful and had no point. So Reagan was, in fact, an extremely shrewd man, and that shrewdness of his had depth. He wasn't just operating on the surface of international relations. What he was doing was seeing into the great social movements that were happening behind the Iron Curtain, and in fact, calling them up to take part in history, which they did.
Let's go to the phones. Patrick from Louisiana, you're on the World Over Live. What's your question, Patrick?
Yes, I'd like to ask the guest. He mentioned Mrs. Thatcher, that she was a Methodist. I had read somewhere where she had later gone to the Anglican Church for political reasons. What was her attitude toward Catholics and the Catholic Church?
Oh, I can answer that question quite easily. By the way, you're correct to correct me, because Mrs. Thatcher was brought up as a Methodist, but later became an Anglican, not, as you say, for political reasons, but because she married an Anglican, Dennis Thatcher, after she'd graduated from university. And I think that also the Methodist Church, actually is an outcrop of the Anglican Church. John Wesley was an Anglican and died believing himself to be a good Anglican. So I don't think there was the same kind of feeling of a break that you would have had if she'd gone, let us say, to become either a Catholic or a Presbyterian of some kind. Now, having said that, I think Mrs. Thatcher's attitude to Catholics is in fact very friendly. She told me once, I wrote her a note when I was working for her saying, I gather that you are an O'Sullivan on your mother's side. And she wrote back saying, actually, it's on my father's side. And she had always been very friendly to Catholics. She had several Catholics and several Jews in her cabinet. And I think that growing up in Grantham, where the Catholics were seen as, in a sense, having a more jolly life than the Methodists, who were quite a sort of sober lot. She said once that the Catholic girls going to the First Communion always wore nice ribbons with their white dresses, and if anyone wore ribbons, people would say, oh, it's the first step to Rome. But I think Mrs. Thatcher liked those ribbons, and I think that she has, I think, a great respect for the Catholic Church.
Do you think Thatcherism could ever return to Britain as it is today and to Europe, or is the EU and the prevailing ethos sort of marginalize that?
At the moment, you would have to say that's true. But remember, the situation was much worse in 1975, 76, when the British had high rates of inflation, total control by the unions, a feeling that the country could not be governed without the consent of labour unions. She solved that one. I think we need someone of her qualities, her character, her strength, to do the same thing. But I don't ever believe in giving up on these things, After all, if we gave up, if we'd given up then, we'd be in a much worse position than we are today.
You're an optimist, John, an optimist. Let's go to the email.
I believe in hope.
Keep hope alive. Here's an email. Why is it that the media has only given President Reagan all the credit and never the Holy Father, Pope John Paul II, for the fall of the Berlin Wall? And wasn't Gorbachev a part of the group in bringing the wall down? I heard that he was. Thank you. God bless.
I think that I wouldn't agree that the media has shortchanged the Pope on this. I think that they have given him credit.
That's fair due.
And I think that, I think the credit is shared. Reagan, Thatcher, John Paul II, the leaders of Eastern Europe and the peoples of Eastern Europe. They're the people who, after all, went into the streets and forced the retreat of communism. What role did Gorbachev play? Well, he's to be given credit for not sending in the tanks and crushing the rebellions. But it also has to be said, and he's to be given credit too for disarming and for reaching the agreements at Reykjavik and then subsequently at Washington. But it's also had to be said that he never intended the collapse of communism. It came about as a result that he tried to reform what the Pope had said was unreformable. And if you try to reform the unreformable, what happens is it collapses.
It implodes. Here's an email that speaks to your point. What was the key component of the fall? The tough talk and military buildup, or the faithfulness of the Pope and all those who remained faithful and put their lives on the line? Thank you, Ken.
Well, I don't think that I'm in a position, I think only God is really in a position to disentangle the precise impact of all of these different factors. I isolate roughly three factors. First of all, the factor of faith. Secondly, the factor of strategic competition, and thirdly, the factor of economic growth and transformation. Each one of those was important. Now, isolated, probably each one of them would not have been able to do the job, but together, and as I say, I think the Pope represents faith, Reagan represents strategic competition, Mrs. Thatcher represents economic transformation. I think together those three things and those three people brought about the end.
Just hobbled it. Yeah, it's amazing. And the qualities they had, the toughness, the surety that they were on the right side in the face of unspeakable scorn. I mean, looking back, it's, oh, look at these three great titans. At the time, they were all pretty much derided for what they were doing.
Well, that is right. And of course, I knew Mrs. Thatcher better than I knew the other two. I met Reagan and I didn't know the Pope really. But I knew Mrs. Thatcher quite well in the 70s. And I can tell you, she was widely dismissed and derided as a kind of deluded person stuck in the past. And she herself was always willing to learn. This is one of the most interesting things about her. She's an extremely hard-working person, a detailed person, much more than Reagan. She really does her homework. But she was prepared to sit down at the knees of people like Milton Friedman and go back to school and learn economics. And she spent 4 years doing that. And those 4 years in opposition, 75 to 79, were, in my view, the basis for her success later.
Let me know what you thought of tonight's show and which of our interviews you'd like to see on an upcoming edition of Conversations the World Over. You can always write me at raymond@raymondarroyo.com. The new show premieres each Wednesday at 5:30 p.m. Eastern Time in the U.S. For those of you outside the United States, go to EWTN.com for your airtimes. On behalf of the staff and crew of EWTN News, I'm Raymond Arroyo. The conversations continue next week. Don't miss them. Bye now.